For years, people saw him as unstoppable, the legend who beat every obstacle life threw at him, the man whose smile could light up an arena, the champion who refused to be defined by fear or weakness. But when a sudden and unexpected shift appeared in his life at 66, the world felt something was wrong before he ever said a word. Fans noticed the small changes first, the slower steps, the softer voice, the moments where he seemed lost in thought instead of leading the crowd with his usual spark. At first it seemed like age catching up, but then came the moment that changed everything. A brief clip from a public event where he looked overwhelmed, almost fragile, as if carrying a weight he didn't want the world to see. Social media exploded with concern. People who grew up watching him dominate the court now watched him steady himself on a chair, take a slow breath, and force a smile that couldn't hide the pain in his eyes. Behind the scenes, his inner circle grew worried. They knew he had always been strong, almost impossibly strong, but this time, something felt different, something felt wrong. The sudden shift wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, something deep within him that had cracked open, and when he finally addressed it, the truth didn't just shock fans, it broke their hearts. Because this wasn't the story of an aging athlete facing the ordinary wear of time. It was the story of a man who had already survived the darkest chapter of his life and was now standing at the edge of another storm he had never expected. His revelation brought tears to millions, not just because of what he said, but because of how human he suddenly became. The global hero, the icon, the survivor was now showing a vulnerability that made him more real, more relatable, and more deeply loved than ever before. The moment spread across continents like a wave of emotion, reminding the world that even the brightest legends carry battles no one sees until the moment they can no longer hide them. What the world didn't know was that behind the cameras, behind the charity events, behind the bright smiles he forced for fans who adored him, he had been fighting a private battle that slowly chipped away at him year after year. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a quiet breaking, the kind that happens when someone carries too much for too long. He kept it hidden because that's who he had always been, the strong one, the survivor, the man who refused to let pain define him. But deep inside, old memories he had spent decades trying to bury began pushing their way back to the surface. Memories of hospital rooms, late-night conversations with doctors, and the moment he once thought his life was over. Every time he tried to ignore these thoughts, they grew louder, more demanding, as if his past was knocking on the door he had desperately tried to keep shut. His family noticed the change first. The quiet sighs, the vacant stares, the nights he stared at the floor instead of joining in laughter, but he brushed them off, telling them he was just tired, just busy, just thinking. Only he knew the truth. He was reliving pain he never wanted to face again. It reached a breaking point when a medical scare forced him back into the doctor's office, stirring up emotions he thought he had conquered years ago. When the doctor mentioned something that echoed his past diagnosis, he felt his heart sink and his hands tremble. It wasn't a relapse, but it was close enough to shatter the emotional wall he had built around himself. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't think. He felt like the 32-year-old version of himself all over again, scared, confused, fighting tears he didn't want anyone to see. Friends who saw him afterward said they had never seen him so quiet, so reflective, so shaken. He didn't want pity. He didn't want attention. He wanted answers. He wanted peace. He wanted to stop feeling like he was walking through life with a clock ticking somewhere in the background. The struggle he finally revealed wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, and deeply personal. And when he spoke about it publicly, the world finally understood the weight he had been carrying, a weight heavy enough to make even the strongest heroes bend. When the doctor sat him down and began explaining the results, the room felt colder than it should have. He had faced terrifying news before, but something about this moment hit him differently, deeper, sharper, like a wound reopening after years of healing. The doctor's expression alone sent a chill through him, instantly dragging him back to the darkest time of his life, a time he thought he had locked away forever. As the words unfolded, he felt a familiar fear creeping up his spine, the same fear he once battled when the world first learned about the diagnosis that nearly ended everything he had worked for. Although this time wasn't a relapse, the doctors warned him of complications that could become dangerous if ignored. It was enough to shake him to his core. Memories rushed back like a tidal wave, the sleepless nights, the heavy silence in the hospital room, the uncertainty about his future, the worried look in his family's eyes. Suddenly, he wasn't just a 66-year-old legend sitting in a doctor's office. He was once again the young man whose life changed overnight, fighting tears he refused to let fall. He had promised himself he would never allow fear to control him again, but hearing the doctor speak reopened a part of his heart he had tried to seal shut. It wasn't the illness itself that terrified him. It was the reminder of how fragile everything truly is. The world saw him as strong, unstoppable, larger than life, but in that moment, he felt small, human, breakable. His family could see the shift immediately. When he came home, he didn't talk much. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at nothing, breathing slowly, whispering prayers under his breath. His wife gently touched his shoulder, and he finally broke, not in anger, not in panic, but in a silent, painful release. He admitted he was scared, scared of the unknown, scared of history repeating itself, scared of disappointing the millions who believed he had already conquered everything. This emotional weight followed him for days. He tried to stay strong in public, but behind the scenes he wrestled with the haunting echo of the past. The doctor's news didn't just affect his health, it reopened a door he had closed decades ago, reminding him that even the strongest survivors sometimes find themselves standing face to face with old shadows they hoped were gone forever. It happened at a charity event meant to celebrate hope, community, and the joy he had spent a lifetime spreading. But instead, it became the moment that sent fear across the world. The cameras were rolling, the crowd was cheering, and everything seemed normal as he stepped on stage with that familiar smile. But then, something shifted, his posture changed. His breathing slowed, his eyes lost focus for a split second, and he reached for the podium as if the ground beneath him had tilted. The audience thought it was just a stumble, a simple misstep, but those closest to him knew instantly that something was wrong. He tried to continue speaking, but his voice trembled, barely audible, and he paused longer than anyone had ever seen him pause. A wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. Phones came out. People started filming without fully understanding what was unfolding. And then, in the middle of his speech, he stopped, completely. He pressed his hand against his chest, closed his eyes, and took a deep, shaky breath. For a moment, that felt frozen in time. He looked like a man trying desperately not to collapse. Security moved toward him, but he signaled for them to stay back, forcing himself to straighten up, as if refusing help was the only strength he had left. His smile returned, but the pain behind it was impossible to hide. He wrapped up the speech quickly, holding onto the edges of the podium with both hands, and walked off stage slower than he ever had in his life. Within minutes, the clip hit social media. People rewound it, zoomed in, analyzed every second, every expression, every tremble in his voice. Fans were terrified. Headlines exploded with speculation. Some claimed it was exhaustion, others suspected something far more serious. And as the video went viral, the concern turned into global panic. Doctors who saw the footage shared their worries anonymously. Fans sent thousands of messages to his family, begging for updates. And behind the scenes, his loved ones rushed him to be checked, their hearts pounding with fear that history might be repeating itself. What made this incident so chilling wasn't just the stumble or the pause, it was the look on his face, a look no one had seen since the darkest days of his past. It was a look that told the truth before he ever spoke it aloud. The fight he thought he had beaten was still haunting him, still chasing him, still testing the limits of the strength he had spent a lifetime building. His family had always been his foundation, the quiet strength behind his public victories. But as he entered this new, terrifying chapter, they found themselves watching him with a level of fear they hadn't felt in decades. They noticed the subtle changes long before the world did. The nights he couldn't sleep, the mornings he moved slower than usual, the distant look in his eyes as if he were lost somewhere deep in his thoughts. His wife saw him sitting alone on the couch, staring at the floor, gripping his hands together as if holding himself together was becoming harder each day. His children sensed the shift too. The man who once filled rooms with laughter now fell silent during family dinners, offering forced smiles that didn't reach his eyes. At first, they tried to reassure themselves. They said it was stress, age, exhaustion. But the more they watched, the more they realized the truth he hadn't spoken yet. He was hurting, deeply, quietly, and painfully. One night, his son walked into the living room and found him wiping his eyes, something he had almost never seen in his entire life. When he asked what was wrong, Magic hesitated, his voice cracked, and for the first time in years, he admitted that the weight of everything, the past, the present, the pressure to stay strong, was wearing him down. His family gathered around him, and what followed was a moment of raw, heartbreaking honesty. They shared their fears, their heartbreak, and the emotional toll of watching the man they loved slowly retreat into himself. They confessed they'd been terrified ever since that charity event video went viral, terrified that his past health battles were returning to steal him away from them again. They revealed how helpless they felt each time he winced in pain or paused mid-sentence, as if the world around him suddenly blurred. They admitted that, behind their support and encouragement, there was a constant, silent dread that something terrible was happening, something he wasn't telling them. Seeing their tears broke something inside him. The strong father, the unshakable icon, the man who had always carried everyone else, suddenly realized he could no longer hide behind strength. His family reminded him that he didn't have to fight alone, that vulnerability wasn't weakness, and that love was powerful enough to carry him through even this. Their honesty didn't just reveal how deeply they feared losing him, it showed how much he meant to them, not as a legend, not as a celebrity, but as a husband, a father, and a human being fighting battles no one else could fully understand. When he finally stepped forward to speak, the world seemed to lean in all at once, as if millions of hearts paused together, waiting for the truth he had kept buried for far too long. He sat down in front of the camera, not as the larger-than-life athlete people worshipped, not as the billionaire businessman, not as the unbreakable survivor, but as a human being who had finally reached the point where silence was no longer possible. His voice trembled at first, the weight of years pressing against every word, and when he began to confess what he had been carrying inside, an emotional wave swept across everyone listening. There was no script, no polished message, no rehearsed strength. He spoke with raw honesty, the kind that cuts into the soul of anyone who hears it. He talked about fear, not the kind that comes from facing an opponent on the court, but the kind that comes in the quiet hours of the night when the mind whispers questions too painful to answer. He talked about exhaustion, not physical tiredness, but the heavy, grinding fatigue of being expected to stay strong for the entire world. He talked about health scares that shook him to his core, moments where he felt history gripping at his ankles, pulling him back into memories he prayed he would never relive. He admitted the pressure of being a symbol, a survivor, a beacon of hope, had begun to suffocate him, turning every breath into a silent battle. As he spoke, his eyes watered, not from weakness, but from finally releasing truth he had kept locked inside for decades. Viewers watching from around the world felt the pain in his voice, the vulnerability he had tried so hard to hide, the humanity beneath the legend. Families cried, fans held their breath, comment sections filled with prayers, support, and disbelief. This wasn't the Magic Johnson people thought they knew. This was the man behind the legend, the man who had endured unimaginable battles long before the cameras ever turned on him. And when he finished, there was a stillness that felt almost sacred. No applause, no cheering, just quiet respect for a man who had finally allowed the world to see the truth behind his strength. His honesty didn't diminish his legacy, it deepened it. It reminded everyone that even the greatest heroes bleed, fear, and break, and in that moment, he gave the world something far more powerful than a victory or an achievement. He gave them his heart. In the end, everything he tried to face alone finally came into the light, not to weaken him, but to free him. The world that once celebrated his victories now stood with him through his vulnerability, proving that true strength isn't found in trophies or championships, but in the courage to tell the truth when it hurts the most. His journey reminded millions that even heroes grow tired, even giants feel fear, and even legends need love. And as he stepped away from the spotlight that day, it wasn't as an athlete or an icon, it was as a man who had survived more than most people will ever understand. His confession didn't mark the end of his story, it marked the beginning of a new chapter filled with gratitude, clarity, and a deeper appreciation for every breath, every step, and every moment with the people who never left his side. And for everyone watching, it became a powerful reminder that life's greatest battles aren't always the ones fought in public, but the ones survived in silence until the heart can finally speak.